So, hello everybody. It's 4 p.m. and it's time to start this first webinar and incentive talk of the webinar series of AQUACOSM-plus. And this webinar series is called Consequences of Global Change on Aquatic Ecosystems. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Hans-Otto Pörtner for this first incentive talk with the title Contributions of Aquatic Experimental Ecology and Physiology to address the consequences of global climate change. And I'm now going to introduce Hans-Otto, Professor Pörtner, a bit more, and then I will very shortly give some technical notes before I give the floor to Professor Pörtner. So Hans-Otto is a professor and also head of department of the Department of Integrative Ecophysiology at the Alfred Wegener Institute, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research. And he's also a prominent expert within the IPCC. So currently he's co-chairing the working group 2 in the 6th assessment cycle, but he has also had many other duties within the IPCC. To name a few, within the 4th assessment cycle, he was lead author for the special report on carbon capture and storage. And within the 5th assessment cycle, he was coordinating lead author of Chapter 6 on ocean systems of the Working Group 2 report. He was also member of the author teams for Working Group 2, Summary for Policymakers and a Technical Summary. And he was member of the core writing team for the synthesis report. So with this very short introduction to our prominent speaker, I will pass on to shortly say a few technicalities. So by default, the participants, attendants here do not have audio or video or screen share rights. However, this is an interactive event, so please use the questions and answers button during the talk already. So we here will collect those questions and pass them on to Professor Pörtner at the end of his talk. And you can also use the chat function for other communication. So with those words, please, Professor Pörtner, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here with you and speak to you about our current work in the IPCC, building on some history. And this seems to be a very special community, and I'm certainly would be interested to learn more about what you are doing at some point. I hope you can all hear me. Maybe if you can give me a sign, Marco, whether everything's fine.
It looks great from my computer, thank you, and I can hear you very well, so thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and we are currently in the 6th assessment cycle, and some people say it's the most important cycle in IPCC history in light of the envisioned implementation of the Paris Agreement and in light of the ongoing changes in ecosystems, in society, and the impacts on humankind. And in our working group, we are assessing research on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And we are certainly play a role in setting ambition with respect to climate change, setting ambition in adaptation and mitigation. And both are important because climate has already changed. Adaptation is unavoidable, and ambitious mitigation is actually essential for adaptation to be successful. And the findings of this working group have been essential in setting the climate targets of the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was a landmark in the science policy interface. And but that this landmark is not really sort of finishing the story we can see in the current policy debates and in the debates in individual countries, whether these climate targets should and will actually be implemented. Now, in this assessment cycle, we have already done some work. I think we are, in terms of the number of reports the most productive assessment cycle of the IPCC. So far, we have published 3 special reports starting in 2018 with a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees upon invitation special invitation by the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement community. And we have accepted that invitation, and we have also produced a special report on climate change and land, considering desertification, land degradation, and so forth, and food security, last not least, and most importantly. And finally, in the last year, we have released a special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And this is certainly closest to what you are interested in terms of understanding how aquatic ecosystems are suffering and are responding to the challenges of climate change. And I will give you a little bit of a background in terms of how we do our assessment, because in the talk title, we use the word assess. And the question is really, what does assess really mean? Every word is kind of gaining a special meaning or a special nuance, at least in the context of the IPCC. Now, IPCC products in its history have made an impact. The first assessment report led to the foundation of the Climate Convention of the UNFCCC, our stakeholders essentially. The second report informed the Kyoto Protocol. The third report focused attention on impacts of climate change and the need for adaptation. And the fourth report already led to, and I shouldn't say already, but it led to a discussion of a climate target, and there was a decision on a 2-degree limit as a basis for the post-Kyoto Protocol agreement. And last not least, the fifth assessment report in 2014 was setting the stage for the Paris Agreement, where countries agreed on limiting global warming to significantly below 2 degrees, if not 1.5 degrees. And that is where we got the mandate to produce the 1.5 special report. So this is certainly a milestone in IPCC history. And these reports are important not only for our stakeholders, UNFCCC, but they are also important for the scientific community who likes to look at it as nice summaries of the science relevant in the context of climate change, and also society looking at this in terms of developing towards sustainability. And this is matching with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and climate action is involved, and there is life below water involved, life on land, and it covers many other aspects in society, from human health to societal functioning. And there's one key result from the 1.5 report, that actually keeping to the Paris climate targets, especially 1.5 degrees, enhances the chance of reaching SDGs, and we are still struggling to do so. They should be reached, all of them, by 2030, and with a drifting climate beyond 1.5, this goal may actually get out of reach. But let's move into the more specific context, specific areas, and talk about life below water, and see what we can say about climate change in the ocean. What do we need to measure if we look at climate change in the ocean or in aquatic ecosystems in general? And first of all, there's certainly temperature. It's kind of all the thinking is around temperature in the specific environments and ecosystems that we are looking at. With our stakeholders, certainly there is a value of global mean temperature, which is, for example, represented by these climate targets, which is then always essential to refer back to. And we also need to differentiate between scenarios. Here we have two scenarios compared, one extreme, which is sort of the upper end of possibilities, RCP 8.5, unabated emissions And although there is currently a discussion whether this is really business as usual, there is a possibility of this being the upper end of business as usual options, and these unabated emissions will take us and will take the ocean into a phase of unabated global warming. And then there is a very ambitious or an ambitious emissions reduction scenario, RCP 2.6, and this would take us on this scale to global warming in the ocean of about 1 degree, but you should notice it's more like 1.5 degrees because the pre-industrial is here shown as a below zero value. So you see how these temperatures are projected to change. There is a range where actually both scenarios, and this is over the current decades really, those scenarios cannot really be distinguished in terms of how they develop. This is difficult for the human mind to capture because still current decisions are decisive as to where we are heading towards stronger degrees of warming, or whether it will be possible to stable global mean temperature at some point. And then there is another issue, ocean acidification, where we also go over time from pre-industrial to the end of this century. We have already seen a certain degree of acidification in the ocean. And the good news is, and it is emphasized by the 1.5 report, emissions will not go on in terms of causing acidification. If we are able to stop them, we can stop climate change. If we cut back on emissions, the inertia in the system is not so large that it will make this impossible. So emission control, emission reduction is the strongest mean to keep climate change under control. And for ocean acidification, that means again deciding between unabated development of acidification and a situation where we can actually stabilize ocean pH at a somewhat lower value. And then an aspect that has been emphasized recently, that is the loss of ocean oxygen content due to warming and the layering of the ocean, the stratification of the ocean. We see a trend of oxygen loss, and the mean values in terms of several % changes over time until end of century are not really reflecting what can be going on in individual ecosystems, be it in the oxygen minimum layers, which are strengthened, or be it in coastal areas, which are additionally seeing eutrophication by human activities and the respective reduction of oxygen to zero, causing all higher life to disappear and therefore being called dead zones. And the combination of these three drivers is certainly, these three key climate drivers will certainly be having its own effect. And some people talk about the deadly trio, and there are some ecosystems where you can see those combinations of warming, acidification, and oxygen losses. Now, how to put findings of this into policy context? There is UNFCCC Article 2, which has the goal to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. We could debate whether we are already in a phase of dangerous anthropogenic interference at this time. There is a request to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. And we can already say for some systems we have surpassed a threshold where we see that ecosystem going downhill continually with climate change. Ensure that food production is not threatened. We are on the verge of actually threatening food production, and enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. And we are certainly in a situation, and the 1.5 report has witnessed that, where economic development is harmed by climate change. So a continuous question for different systems, depending on the region, the country, the continent where we are, certainly we still need to ask which degree of climate change is dangerous. How do we capture actually adaptation? Most of the discussion on adaptation in the UNFCCC context is human on human action, but there is also, as we know as biologists, evolutionary adaptation. And how do we link climate to economic development? That's an important question to ask. And for us, as we, and this community, a question to ask is actually, in this wide context, what kind of place do we have here for experimental studies, be it experimental studies on individual species or on mesocosms, trying to understand how an ecosystem functions. And there is already one point to be said. Experimental work has a role in the context of detection and attribution, and this is an important principle in climate assessment. So we need to be very careful when you use the word assessing climate change, because first of all, we need to be detecting a change in a system that is affected by climate, and we need to be outside of its natural variability. There must be a likelihood of occurrence by chance, by internal variability alone, that needs to be small, for example, below 10%. And then we need to be able to attribute these changes in that system to the causal factors. So, and also ideally to the relative contributions of causal factors. And these causal factors must be involved in a changing climate. And there are quite a few. And then I've just mentioned the three key ones for the ocean, but you can also think about wave action and sea level rise and many other processes that are actually influenced by the climate. So we need to attribute a significant portion of the observed change in a responsive system to detected trends in climate with some confidence to the means, to the variability, to the strengths and the timing of extreme events, for example. And this relates for our working group to changes in the climate system, regardless of the cause of the climatic changes. This feels a little bit hypothetical in the context of global climate change going on and being 100% attributed to human activities currently, but you can imagine that for any region and a regional change, it is not so clear if something changes that actually the global climate system is involved in those changes. So there are some challenges involved with that. And so ideally, attribution to anthropogenic climate change is important, teasing apart the degree to which such changes can be related to the component of climate change that is being driven by increasing levels of greenhouse gases. This is quite technical, but it's one of the pillars, one of the foundations of our activities in the assessment reports. And then putting experiments into context, there's also another aspect to be mentioned, and that is we need to draw on multiple lines of evidence in order to enhance the confidence in our understanding. And here, this is listed for coral reefs, and it is considering the climate variable in action, for example, ocean warming, then whether such variable has already played a role in Earth's history, in considering paleo data, and then whether there is a causal relationship based on that history. And for example, whether the observation of the first mass tropical coral bleaching in 1979 is actually caused by the increase in sea surface temperature. And then there is a value for long-term data series where we look at association between climate variables and responses, and coral bleaching consistently following warm sea surface temperature events is then is an indication that there is a causal relationship, but correlation is not necessarily causation. You know that, so there needs to be further work, and that is where the experiments come into play. You can modify a factor in an experimental system, and you can look at the characteristics of that system and its responses, to what extent these responses are typical, obligatory, and also, if you go down deeper, and that is essential, certainly more from a point of view of a physiologist maybe, but you want to also understand the underlying mechanisms. And then, as you cannot investigate the whole world at once, I think meta-analyses become more and more important, where we look at what the literature has to say if we investigate or re-investigate it after formulating relevant hypotheses. And some of these meta-analyses have been very strong in supporting or rejecting existing hypotheses. So the current losses of corals certainly can be attributed to anthropogenic climate change, and you can build projections on that insight after understanding what is going on, and your knowledge will be deepened if you even understand the mechanisms that are contributing. Emphasizing again what is an assessment. An assessment is not just a review, because certainly we do not do research in the IPCC. We are looking at what is being reported in the scientific literature. Highest level would be peer-reviewed literature, but for some fields, we also take into account the so-called gray literature, because, for example, in the mitigation arena and in industrial contexts, often there is no peer-reviewed literature available, but they are very well documented reports that will then be included in the assessment. The assessment is objectively summarizing the state of knowledge in a balanced way, and most importantly, it's complemented by a very systematic statement of confidence and uncertainty. It is to be policy relevant and not policy prescriptive. So it does not need to cover all of the literature in the field, although there is a lot of, in the chapters of our reports, there is a lot of background information often included, which makes them these reports are also very interesting in the scientific world. It's a consensus document produced by the author team. So individual views are not as important in this context. Assessment statements should be agreed as a group based on expert judgment. And we use a precise, calibrated language in our reports, especially in the summary for policymakers, which is a distillation product of those reports for policymakers. The previous reports that have actually focused on ocean ecosystems have identified vulnerable ecosystems. And in terms of the events that have been taken into account in these assessments, let me focus once again on the warm water coral reefs, which are under various pressures. And you see a healthy reef on the left, one that is bleached, losing the endosymbiotic algae in the middle, and one that has been exposed to a heat wave for too long and has died off, and the system changes into one with a much lower degree of biodiversity. There is the observation, there's a loss of coral cover due to various drivers, and here the time period considered here indicates that during that time period between 86 and 2012, there has been a 50% loss of live coral cover, and there has been an attribution to causes involving the crown of thorns starfish as a predator, then the intensity of cyclones, and then to some degree in the early 2000s, bleaching. And this is certainly going on. Now, with recent observations, as documented in the 1.5 report, we even can see those bleaching events from high up. And then if we look at the projections into the future, there's a high risk of losing up to 90% of coral reefs and their services to humankind in a 1.5 degree warmer world. So this system clearly is already beyond the tipping point. But we want to also understand not only that one system as a whole, but also the fate of the species in that system. And in order to build a cause and effect understanding, we would need a step-by-step approach. And one approach has been by meta-analysis, for example, to look at the thermal limits of marine species and to look at how these thermal limits sort of increase. Or you can start, if you start with the most simple ones, you can say they start at a very, very high level beyond 110, 120 degrees in the archaea. And then the bacteria, they have lower thermal limits across a wide range. And then once you come to eukarya, they are moving more towards the 40 to 42, 43 degrees temperature limit. And the same limit is valid for plants and animals. And you're wondering, because this is an important principle, thermal tolerance in ecosystems with respect to climate change, what is the underlying cause for this pattern? And there was a hypothesis developed in this analysis where we hypothesized that actually the degree of complexity of these organisms would play a role, where the multicellular eukarya would have a lower upper thermal limit than the unicellular organisms and the prokaryotes, because they are more complex, because there are more compartments to be coordinated and so forth. This is an idea, it's a hypothesis, and it needs to be certainly investigated, and experimental research is still out to test actually this hypothesis. The question is whether complexity is setting evolutionary limits. And then there are other principles that seemed to emerge over time when this research was being carried out, and which helps actually findings which help this to explain the ecological findings and the role of climate drivers. And here you see findings for a fish species in the North Sea, where you see in the top panel here how the abundance of the species falls in warm summers with rising local temperature, and how this actually matches the decline in growth during that same temperature range for that species on the temperature-dependent growth curve that is available. And then if you look at what is happening actually in the physiology of that species, you see that the cardiocirculatory system is approaching some kind of limit here. It is no longer responding to warming with an increase, it's leveling off. And actually the point of decline in abundance kind of matches that point where blood circulation is leveling off during warming, and then later on you see an increase in anaerobic metabolites. So there are several messages from this. Individual study, very clearly. Measuring growth seems good. It includes acclimatization and energy budget trade-offs. It indicates where the individuals are reaching the limits of their acclimatization mechanisms. And then we see a loss of fitness, performance capacity, which relates to reduced field abundance. And this relates to limited cardiocirculatory capacity in relation to demand. And this was actually one finding which led to the concept of oxygen and capacity limited thermal tolerance, which is currently tested, contested, and debated, but which is still alive in terms of making its way towards an accepted principle, but still has several questions around it. There's one certainly point that I would like to make here. Assessments benefit from overarching concepts and hypotheses that are addressing and identifying unifying principles in the system that we are working with. Then you can make statements with a high level of confidence, and you are building your insights on more than empirical findings. So we have confidence to assess, and you see here examples in this table. concerning range shifts, training in community position, and then there is a confidence attributed to detection, then to attribution, and whether the process indicated has a major role. And we can, by contributing to a mechanism-based cause and effect understanding, we can actually enhance confidence in our statements, helping the detection of impacts and their attribution to climate change, most ideally so identifying unifying principles of impact and adaptation across phyla. And we make an effort to build consensus on those insights by drawing together multiple lines of evidence, including beyond experimental. And this is something which not many experimenters really do, put their findings into a wider context. Now, there is an approach to assess and characterize confidence in reported findings. We use what we call calibrated language. And we have a very fine-tuned, or maybe not very fine-tuned, but we have a very systematic approach to assess the confidence language, and we have a guidance node that is actually helping us to do this based on expert judgments of the author team. So we distinguish between the combinations of agreement and evidence, agreement in the scientific community, and the evidence level as coming from the literature are being assessed by the author team responsible for a chapter. And depending on these, admittedly a relatively rough scale, because we distinguish between high, medium, and low, we can allocate confidence levels from very low to very high. And only the very high confidence and high confidence statements will actually then make it into the summary for policymakers. Medium confidence sometimes, if it concerns important findings. And this is an example from the last assessment report from the AR5, where actually for different regions, there were some key findings, some key observations of climate impacts depicted for various sectors, going from physical systems to biological systems to human and managed systems. And then there were ocean findings also included, indicated by the fish, and this stack of bars here indicates the level of confidence in attribution to climate change. So that was a very popular finding or popular figure then also in outreach events afterwards, and it supported the statements that climate change is already having an impact on all continents and in all oceans. But let's go back to principles. For example, there's one principle in the ocean, and that's actually the oceans are a very clear system for developing that conclusion, that actually climate change is causing the worldwide movement of marine species. And they move by several kilometers per decade, and it seems that all organism groups are actually affected, and they move poleward. They try to stay in their preferred temperature ranges with some ups and downs, and this exception here, the non-bony fishes, hasn't yet been fully explained to what extent it's a kind of an artifactual conclusion from the literature. How to explain these observations in animals and across organism domains? And this has to do about principles again. We have upper thermal limits, we have lower thermal limits, and we have a temperature in between where the organism likes to be. What we also see when we go across latitudes from the tropics to high latitudes, and this is regardless of whether it's north or south, we see a narrowing of the thermal range towards the high latitudes. So there seems to be something about the width of the temperature range of the organism in terms of its importance. And there's another principle to be mentioned here, and that is the thermal performance curve. So the width of any temperature window for an organism is reflected in the width of the thermal curve. And here we have as principle schematic comparison of a eurotherm with the warmest depth stenotherm and a polar stenotherm. And you see how these curves overlap and how each of these curves may actually be dynamic, influenced by adaptation, acclimation, or additional drivers, just like CO2 or hypoxia. And there's one principle already I would like to indicate here, where these curves overlap. That is actually where these species can coexist. So it seems to be a principle that we need to consider when we look at how an ecosystem is building up from the coexistence of various species and how this can change under the influence of environmental dynamics. And these interactions between drivers are not widely considered in modeling efforts. And there are some recent advances here where we indicate that actually the vulnerability of a species in the assessments is jumping to higher levels when we consider the impact of combined drivers. And there, in the literature, there are questions being asked. Can we predict the responses using thermal performance curves and body temperatures? Do we have proxies for the thermal performance curve? I've already shown you growth, and it seems that growth is a nice integrative proxy that integrates various performance curves. Whereas other tests, for example, tests for extreme thermal limits, the lethal temperatures or CT max values, are not as useful for indicating overall performance and its thermal limitation. There's another aspect to be considered. When we talk about a species, we have to consider life stages. And at the time in 2008, when we published this schematic here, there weren't a lot of findings around. But there was some indication that we would have narrow windows at eggs and early larvae, in this case of fish, and at spawning stage, and that actually we would have wide thermal ranges for juveniles and growing adults. And there are some principles behind. There are developmental constraints on performance which shape thermal window widths, and there is an allometry of thermal specialization, which is a role for body size in shaping thermal limits. And interestingly, finally, just this year, we could confirm that this is a principle that goes across fishes from marine and freshwater systems. For about 700 fish species, we see this pattern actually visible in the literature if we assess the literature based on the relevant hypotheses. An insight coming in here is, considering the debate that has recently been going on, we must consider that the debate has mostly been on the adults. And actually, for a species vulnerability, we need to consider the interdependence of thermal ranges between life stages, which need to be followed through, especially from adult to spawners. You can imagine that an adult needs to have a wide enough thermal range in order to still play out to be beneficial for the spawner when it accumulates the egg stages or sperm. So there is this interrelationship, which is a new insight coming from a meta-analysis, indicating and allowing us to build new hypotheses for our experimental work. This just shows how the allometry plays out for growth windows, how the upper thermal limit is reduced as the fish grows larger, and it's actually more reduced in mature spawners, a hypothesis that is now being confirmed. And we also see here, when we compare fish, and this is Atlantic cod, across latitudes, here North Sea cod, Norwegian coastal cod, and Iceland cod, how actually the thermal windows change and the thermal ranges. So there is obviously also a role for the place where the fish lives and how then the thermal performance curve can shape. And this is true for populations within the same species. We were able to show that actually this relates to oxygen limitation based on blood oxygen measurements, in which are actually relating to the level of oxygen consumption, where populations with high level of oxygen consumption have a lower oxygen tension in the blood and therefore are less are less able to tolerate the higher temperatures. So there are trade-offs in the physiological system that relate to the ecology. This dynamic of the thermal window is indicated here when comparing populations of an invertebrate over seasons between winter, spring, and summer. We see how the baseline energy consumption changes and how this changes relates to different widths of the thermal windows. So there's an underlying genetic element in this that also needs to be considered, that explains the dynamic. And it seems to be, especially in the cold, beneficial to have a narrow window and a low rate of energy turnover, which kind of brings us to, understanding the physiology of Antarctic creatures, for example, that live in the permanent cold. The thermal performance curve is also a principle that is actually important to show us how actually this relates to what some people think are so very important, the molecules and the macromolecules that the organism uses. But if it comes to thermal stress, the synthetic curve covering the performance of the whole organism, and this is here for yeast, is actually constrained much earlier than any of the enzymes that is involved in this organism. So there is a hierarchy building up, a hierarchy indicating that the lower level functions have a wider thermal range than the organismic functions, which matches the hypothesis that complex systems have a narrower thermal range than a simple system or simple organisms. And the narrowest levels are seen, windows are seen at the whole organism. This was also one of the stepping stones in the findings and may indicate a principle that we need to consider whenever we look at, and certainly the ecosystem is the most complex system that we should consider, and the understanding sort of of shifts in ecosystems or between ecosystem states may lead us to involve some of these principles and develop a systematic understanding of what's going on. And some of the underlying principles, as I indicated, are captured by the OCLTT concept, which is indicated here and may be familiar to some of you, indicating that an animal actually lives in a constrained aerobic window. It could be another principle, energetic principle for other organisms, for example, the capacity of photosynthesis. There are thermal limits, there are sublethal limits, then critical limits. There shifts can occur at the level of energy consumers, of mitochondrial functions, of protection mechanisms. There can be strategies like metabolic depression. All of these influence this picture of a thermal range and cause it to be dynamic. And then if we build additional drivers of hypoxia and CO2 on top of temperature, we can understand how they may actually contribute to the dynamic of the thermal performance curve. So these are principles that are supported by findings that have been contested, by findings that we think have not really been carried out with the right approaches. That is certainly something to be discussed. So a healthy debate in our scientific disciplines is important to clarify these issues. But if it comes to us talking to policymakers, what we need, and especially if we are doing basic research, we need to learn that. We need a consensus building mechanism in order to be convincing to the policymakers and really name what we know with the highest level of confidence. So this is a principle that we think is explaining fitness, and it is explaining the routine, and it's actually explaining the realized niche of organisms at ecosystems. If it's an evolutionary principle, then it needs to work for the lower levels. So some people work on mitochondria and what kind of role this plays under warming and acidification. If it's an evolutionary principle, it also plays out at the genetic level. And actually we see the underlying mechanisms changing in their dynamics, and it fits the thermal performance curve of growth in this Antarctic fish, where we see maximum growth happens at the point where we see the lowest genetic activity. So where actually the system is in its optimum balance. If it's an evolutionary principle, it must also play out during evolution in the terrestrial world. And there are some findings emerging. It has been found in an insect model, it has been found in lizard embryos, and it has been found in reptiles, as indicated in this study. So it is something that we still need to follow through to fully understand how that principle really was possibly modified during the course of evolution. What we can say is, if we consider the aerobic principle for animals and their role and the role in routine activity, we can relate that to metabolic habitat and its routine metabolic scope. In the case of cod, we were actually able to qualify the low distribution limit in terms of the low latitude distribution limit of the species according to its minimum level of needed routine metabolic scope. It also explains the dynamics in seasonal change, the change of this lower southern limit with the seasons. It was the southern limit going down during winter and going back north during summer. Or on our side of the Atlantic, the fish goes down deeper into the water during summer, coming back to the surface in winter. And all of this relates to this critical minimum level of routine metabolic scope. So there is a role, and we can bring this into modeling. And we can here, again, take this as a principle to build upon when we talk about interacting species and move into our mesocosm work, where we want to understand how species interactions change and how we can explain and maybe identify the role of climate drivers in that system. Finally, in the last minutes of my talk, I would focus again on what we can do with this kind of information in the policy arena. So we are doing debates about cause and effect and understanding principles and so forth, all within our own principle. For the policymakers, we have to build a convincing picture how this integrates, reflect the state of science most properly with the appropriate level of confidence. But we are now in the climate debate in a time of urgency and high need for policy decisions. How do we actually support those decisions? And that is actually, again, drawing on multiple lines of evidence in terms of looking at the risk for a certain system. So we are doing risk assessment. And here you see that for overarching criteria, but in principle, just to say, we are using a color code in those burning ember diagrams to identify the level of risk from undetectable to moderate to high to very high, where we can qualify the degree of change in a system and attribute a certain level of risk based on expert judgment to what extent we consider this dangerous, detrimental, and so forth. And we can relate that to global mean temperature. So what role does experimental biology play here? Well, we can here put our findings into the context of climate scenarios. We have the climate changes, we have the hazards, we have adaptation, mitigation influences the climate. And here we have the vulnerability assessment for our organisms, and we consider them in terms of how they are being exposed to those changes. Then we put that into a socio-economic context and into a context of climate. And from that, we develop a holistic picture how impacts should steer emissions, should steer political strategies. providing motivation for action. And we can also consider adaptation. It's another way of depicting risk from low to high in these yellow bars, and then the gray bars indicate how in different climate futures we can actually influence the level of risk, whether adaptation can reduce the risk. And this is the 1.5 degree temperature goal in the near term, but this is an AR5 finding, and I'm just putting this into context. And certainly mitigation may actually also play a role here. Mitigation can reduce risk, but mitigation strategies can have their own level of risk. We can look at the high-level systems based on all the knowledge of underlying principles. Here, for example, this is a change in maximum fisheries potential in different climate futures, where we see in the low latitudes there's a reduction, and this assessment is building on the knowledge of the biogeography shifts, of the productivity declines, of the shifts in primary productivity in the ocean. And we see with the degree of climate change how this negative impact is actually projected to be exacerbated in the future. And again, we do the risk assessment for this, and we have large scale we have responses that can be considered like a relocation of industrial fishing activities, which sounds easy, but for the low latitude countries which depend on local fisheries, artisanal fisheries, they are extremely limited in their adaptation options, and that is reflected here. Ocean acidification is another one where we build on meta-analysis for the vulnerabilities of species groups, and you see sort of the fraction of vulnerable species building up in relation to the CO2 levels. And there you have the picture of ocean acidification and the vulnerable ecosystems like the warm water coral reefs or the cold water coral reefs reflected by the purple colors, or the places where people collect mollusks and crustaceans for food. And here, this is all empirical. We cannot do such kind of modeling yet as we have done with the fisheries results, because we don't have a unifying concept yet that we can build into models. So that's a challenge. Generalized mechanism-based spatial modeling approaches need to be developed here. And the fish are not there. How can we do something without the fish? But the confidence on the findings of fishes, especially the behavioral disturbances, is limited in terms of their long-term persistence. So the drawing from multiple lines of evidence, like in the paleo record, is not sufficient here. We cannot say whether fish in the past have suffered from ocean acidification due to behavioral disturbances. So that means not yet to be included in messaging in the summary for policymakers. Life stages are important here, and this is something we can build on with respect to the thermal tolerance ranges as they evolve over the life stage sort of sequence of a species, and you see that curve here indicated. And there we actually found a lever how to actually talk about something that is relevant for the species. And here you see, first of all, the mortality curve for eggs in relation to temperature, how it changes with increased CO2. There is a narrowing of the thermal range. And under those conditions, if we put those eggs into the spawning habitat and consider different climate scenarios, what we can see is that here the fish is safe, whereas there is negative consequences developing under warming, increased warming, and especially under unabated warming, as indicated here by this color scale, which is building up from left to right. So here we have a bottleneck for the species in the habitat. They are at risk of losing major spawning habitats if climate change continues unabated. This is a finding we do not have if we just consider the adults, as a lot of experimental work is actually doing. And limiting global warming to 1.5 will minimize habitat loss, an important finding in this context that has made it into the climate assessment reports. Reducing other stresses is important. Considering ocean acidification on top of warming may actually be informative if we build on the principle of thermal performance curve, and will help us to integrate a sort of a consecutive picture in terms of building on bringing together the different mechanisms that are involved. Another one is the combination of temperature and oxygen, where actually this figure indicates how habitat constraints is emphasized by low oxygen in the ocean. 20% overall in the ocean, and it's building again on the metabolic habitat modeling. And in northern high latitudes, like in the North Pacific, where hypoxia is especially severe already, this constraint is making up for 40% of the habitat constraints because it's constraining the thermal window. So understanding principles such as this is important to build a cause and effect understanding. Oxygen deficiency has been included in the assessments because it also causes a large-scale relocation of fishing activities. Specific fisheries may benefit. At the time, the Humboldt squid fishery was peaking, which is now collapsing again. And we can consider and control nutrient input and pollution eutrophication in that context. Risk assessment can be done for ecosystems, indicated here, for individual elements of the ecosystem. And you see here for the ocean and coastal ecosystems, this risk assessment being carried out from for coral reefs, and then going from kelp to seagrass, epipelagic, rocky shore, salt marshes, cold water corals, estuaries. What I'm indicating here is actually this risk assessment allows to compare the thermal thresholds for all of these in terms of the level of risk that are unfolding with the degree of climate change. And you see only the coral reef system is currently under heavy challenges because it has surpassed the tipping point already. At present day, it's going from yellow to red, and it is in deep trouble at 1.5. Whereas for the other systems, it's looking better. We still have a chance to maintain many of those if we are going into ambitious emissions reduction. This I will skip and will summarize. Mechanism-based science has a role, experimental work has a role. It's important for the detection of climate phenomena and their attribution. It needs to form the basis of improved and more precise modeling efforts. It needs to connect across disciplines and contribute to an integrative view, building on multiple lines of evidence. It can provide basic science messages relevant to policy, and it is also useful to enhance and exploit the science basis of solution options, identifying capacity and limits to adaptation, consider the growth curve and the limits in its shift, identifying ways to enhance blue and green carbon, and supporting sustainable development, conservation, protected areas. So there's a role for this discipline, regardless of whether we work on individual species, and then ideally put the findings into mesocosm work. Bringing diverse phenomena together into a coherent storyline would strengthen a role for experimental biology in climate-related assessment reports. This is one of the messages I would like to bring forward in your discussions, because strengthening our knowledge is still important. We have to overcome societal inertia and inaction in transformation. And ocean findings are among the clearest on climate impacts in relation to degree of climate change. And I'm pretty sure this can also be said to some extent for freshwater ecosystems. Ocean findings help strengthening the UNFCCC process in global stocktake that is actually currently under discussion, and they are needed to enhance and exploit the science basis of solution options. So we should join forces and develop strong consensus statements and key messages from our fields in order to strengthen the climate debate. And you may still feed this information into our assessment reports. We have done the 3 special reports. We are now approaching the phase where our main assessments reports are being brought to completion, shifted by the coronavirus with respect to the dates of delivery. There's still time to produce literature and include relevant findings in these assessments. And you can certainly also become involved as expert reviewers, contributing authors, and so forth. I wish to thank all collaborators who have contributed to help build this large picture and the elements to it. And I wish to thank you for your attention. And I hope this will maybe encourage you and stimulate you to have a fruitful debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Pörtner. That was really, really excellent and enlightening. And I do know that from this community there are citations in the special report on the ocean and the cryosphere, for instance. But I also do know that many of us do not necessarily understand how our work fits into the big picture, and also kind of the future needs and so on. And I know there are some questions in the questions and answers where we also decide this thing is or there's a question about this simply. So we are running a little bit short of time because I stole some of your time in the beginning, Professor Pörtner. But nevertheless, if you have the time, maybe we can take those questions that have come in now, and if it works well for you, I can read them out for you. And unfortunately, we cannot take any more questions at this point. But thank you very much for those who were active during the talk. And Professor Pörtner, I let you decide if you already answered some of those during your talk, because of course some questions came early and some came later. But we have a question here from Sam DuPont, who thanks you for your talk, and he comments first that we're seeing a lot of disinformation regarding all important societal topics such as COVID-19, recently to climate change, which may have dramatic consequences on behavior of voters and then on politics. And his question is, more information does not seem to be the answer, as a lot of real information is already available, but seems to fail to fight against this misinformation. As scientists, what can we do?
I think, well, as an IPCC scientist, certainly I'm bound to the process of accumulating further knowledge, integrating it into the messaging of the IPCC assessment report, and making clear what kind of challenges are ahead. And the clarity and the strength of the messages has been sort of incremental from assessment cycle to assessment cycle to assessment cycle. I mean, imagine several assessment cycles ago, there was still people certainly debating whether climate change is actually happening. I mean, the AR5 answered that very clearly. We have essentially with the 1.5 report said that dangerous climate change is imminent, is already happening in some places, and will be even more dangerous if we go beyond 1.5. There are still some people who keep their hands in the sand despite of this. I fully agree with Sam. And overcoming this kind of inertia in the willingness to understand is the most important bottleneck. I mean, the 1.5 report also went into addressing the societal or addressing the different levels of feasibility. And it turned out that all solutions in principle are feasible with technologies, financing, and so forth and so forth. But the major bottleneck currently is political will. And political will builds on societal pressure. And the societal pressure is developing. I mean, the 1.5 essentially report was, I think, the most influential IPCC assessment report in some respect. It has triggered the Fridays for Future movement. It has triggered the climate demonstrations. So for policymakers in many countries, this pressure is rising. And I know there are still some populist policymakers around who don't buy a dam with respect to acknowledging scientific insight, because they adapt things only according to their own vision. But I mean, the question is whether there is a future for these people, and to what extent society is willing over time to put up with them. There are trials at court in Brazil around the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, and there are trials on the way in the US. Everybody's hoping for a turnaround with the next election. So Sam, don't give up hope. I think there is a chance that we can make a turnaround, but the question is whether it will be fast enough. So emissions in many countries are falling, but the question is whether they will be falling fast enough. So being fast, I think, is currently the main challenge.
Thank you very much for an excellent and also answer, and also one that gives us hope still. So then there are a few questions that are more into detail about the physiological and ecological side. We are talking about the studies that you were referring to. So the first one is if thermal tolerance is dependent on complexity, shouldn't that be seen in development phases? Assuming larvae are simpler than adult organisms, that would mean that larvae should be more thermal tolerant, isn't it? But this is not usually the case.
Yeah, usually the larvae have already a wider tolerance than the eggs. It really depends on the capacity of and development of the physiological systems. And once the circulatory systems and ion exchange systems are in place, my view is that they support a wider range of thermal tolerance, and especially when you talk about young adults, they have the widest thermal windows, which then becomes constrained again with increasing body size. And the spawner having a very narrow range is a body size issue, because these fish accumulate 10 to 20% of their body weight in terms of egg mass, and therefore have to supply this egg mass with fuel and oxygen, and can do this only in a narrower thermal range on the low side of the thermal window than before reaching that kind of maturity. So that seems to be a principle that pretty much holds true, because all of the 600 plus species we looked at in the meta-analysis are in line with this kind of principle. So there are energy trade-offs between the width of thermal window and the level of energy turnover, and there are and part of this trade-offs involve oxygen supply mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's a question about including adaptive evolution experiments in order to better anticipate the way species will be impacted by climate change.
Yeah, that is an ongoing discussion, and we are actually currently having that discussion also in our main assessment report for both terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. And I think there is still one overarching finding that holds, insight that holds from the last assessment report, and that is that ongoing climate change is too fast for species to adapt, and that is why they move. So the movement, which is seen by some as an adaptation mechanism, is you can equally see as an escape mechanism from the challenges, staying with the to the extent possible with the preferred temperature, giving up on previous habitat. There is a discussion also going on with respect to what adaptation actually means. What does adaptation mean for humans? Because we have the same issue. I mean, there are some places on the planet where we will be losing human habitat. Habitability is lost due to sea level rise. It's lost due to excessive heat waves, especially in the low latitudes in the tropics. And again, drawing on multiple evidence, and forgive me for just pulling this in very sort of as a rough argument, but there have been times in Earth's history where actually the low latitudes have been void of higher life. Animal life have not been living where they now are, indicating that we are pushing our planet out of the comfort zone and pushing it out of a temperature range where higher life, including us, was able to colonize all of it.
Yes, I think it's good to keep these geological scales in mind, actually, because it's really serious business that we're talking about. Then we have a question which I think is really big one, but if you can find a short answer, that would be great. How can we improve the understanding of the increased range of invasive species and plan some conservation and mitigation strategies in the face of climate change and increased human impacts?
Yeah, let me answer that. The concept of invasive species is kind of changing because species that have been invasive because they are ecologically dominant and have been transferred to new environments and have taken over because of lack of natural enemies and so forth. That's one side. The other side is that any species with respect to climate-driven shift in biogeography can become an invasive species in a new place. So the borderlines here are somehow blurred. This doesn't take away the more traditional problems with the invasive species and the mixing of ecosystems due to human activities. But this mixing is strongly exacerbated by climate change. And if I may make a point on the COVID discussion, actually we are involved at the moment in some activities with IPBES, the biodiversity platform, which is our sister organization. And in that discussion, there's one insight very clearly. All the places on land where humans have changed the natural environment and where they are penetrating nature, reducing biodiversity, interestingly, those species remaining, and a larger fraction of those species are host species for diseases. So with our current human trends of penetrating nature everywhere, we are increasing the risk of future pandemics, and COVID-19 may just have been one of those along the way. So there's something to be learned, and we will be pulling this insight into our assessment report. And this is so important then to keep going with these IPCC assessments, because on each cycle the message is becoming stronger and stronger and stronger until the last policymaker is convinced that there is something to it.
Yeah, it's great that you keep going. All of you have been following your work in one of the meetings, so it's fantastic. So last question here, and we're running out of time, or did already, and this is one we will address in the Word Cafe for those who will attend that one, but maybe we can shortly touch on it here anyway. So this is from Professor Ulf Riebezel, and he is asking that from an IPCC perspective, where do you see the largest knowledge gaps for an informed assessment of aquatic ecosystem change, adaptation, and mitigation?
The largest challenge I see, and first of all, hello Ulf, it's nice to be with you in the same kind of virtual room again. The largest challenge for aquatic systems is to understand the limits to adaptation, and that's the same for terrestrial systems actually as well. We have an understanding what to do in terms of mitigation, qualitative. We can say our quantitative requests are such and such, and Fridays for Future actually does a good job in that, and we know from our research sort of where some of how we can actually implement the climate targets. But if we talk about biological systems like aquatic systems and ecosystems in terms of understanding the limits of adaptability of species, is important piece of information that we currently do not have in the assessment reports, and we don't want to have the same thing happening as we see currently with the coral reefs, where we already see that we have surpassed the tipping point and we are on a downslide. Continually we'll be losing that kind of system. A precondition for understanding limits to adaptation is certainly understanding the mechanisms that are changed by adaptation or acclimation, and it's going deep into the genetics of it. But it also has functional implications and functional mechanisms to be identified at organism and ecosystem level that kind of are connected to this. And I think all of this needs to go together to have a good understanding of plasticity and limits to plasticity, if I may use that word as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Pörtner. I know I promised it was the last question, but we missed one which came in the chat, so maybe we can take that very rapidly as well. So the last one would then be, how do you think that findings from mesocosms can be used or upscaled to natural aquatic ecosystems with respect to climate change?
Well, maybe a physiologist is not exactly the person that you want to ask this, if I may fall back into my kind of disciplinary home. Because for me, moving from the physiology of an individual species and its life stages into a mesocosm is already something where I want to be so understanding the mechanism. How does the artificial ecosystem in a mesocosm work, building on what I know about the mechanisms in the individual species, and that scaling up to a natural ecosystem is another step forward. And it's a challenge, and it's if you want to do it systematically, you need time, a lot of time, and different levels of experimentation. And in a climate change context, certainly we are running out of time for this. I mean, we want to make a contribution. So in the climate debate, and that is why we, I think, this drawing on multiple lines of evidence and making connections by systematic analysis, meta-analysis across disciplinary borders is something we should be doing. We should be facilitating modeling, supporting modeling, being certainly critical of it in terms of what it can really do. And thereby, I think, again, from cycle to cycle, we will be improving the precision of our messaging. So relying just on experiments has its limitations. It's time consuming, and that's why I think forming consortia, just like the one you have currently formed, is a good step in bringing all these different insights into the picture. Yes,
thank you, Professor Pörtner. And I think your message on this multiple line of evidence was an eye-opener and a very strong one. So thank you very much also for that. And with that, Professor Pörtner, I thank you very much for your excellent talk, which gave us many thoughts and a lot to keep in mind in the future. I thank all active attendants, and I would like to take the opportunity to remind of the next webinar, which will be in 1 week, October 14th, and it will be by Andreas Orklies from Geomar. So I guess most of you have seen the invitation with all these webinars, so please refer to that. Have a nice evening. So now we break here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.